professor at, and this meeting is being recorded. So Dr. Verma is a professor at Carleton University and also a research scholar at UCLA. She also has a background at a wealth of different universities and working in many different countries, including Bhutan, which I believe will be one of the main focuses of her talk today. Ritu works at the intersection of political ecology and development studies, and has worked in more policy-focused papers as well as academia. She's working on a book on decolonial degrowth at the moment, which I think this talk is a bit of a taster of, which is going to be very interesting. And yeah, we're really lucky to have Ritu with us today because I think thinking about how degrowth travels in the global south and what issues are specifically relevant in the global south, how, for example, economic neocolonialism affects conversations about degrowth and how degrowth can work with already existing alternatives to growth that are taking place in the global south are all questions a lot of us are thinking about at the moment. So yeah, we're very lucky to have Ritu with us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. So I hope the people online can hear. So thank you for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Real Project for inviting me.
I think you are not in the camera. It's somewhere there, right? So that
It's
the other camera.
Yeah, it's the other camera that's out. We don't know why.
So they can't see me?
Mm.
I'll just say hi. How's that?
Yeah, if you can, yes.
Hi.
No, you can sense the camera and then the screen.
Yeah, let's try that. First, we have to decide. A camera, yeah, let's see, there's options. Let's try this one.
Can you do? Yes.
Yes, there we go.
You're right.
Now they can see me?
Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Okay, a little bit more.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Right. So I was just saying I wanted to thank the Real Project and Georgios for inviting me. So, hey, there we go. So I want to start with some caveats. This is a work in progress. These are initial reflections. I'm still thinking and working through the concept of decolonial degrowth and analyzing a much larger body of work and research on Bhutan. Wait, how do we get to the next page? Okay, we're gonna get to it. Perfect.
The ours should work.
All right, okay, good. Yeah, so I'm writing this. This is really based on a chapter of my forthcoming book that's due out next year on decolonial degrowth. And again, so this is a series of reflection, and I hope you'll bear with me on this journey. And I have to warn you, this presentation raises more questions than it answers. I want to explain my degrowth journey, how I got here. I didn't directly come into the degrowth movement and scholarship. It's really been an unforeseen organic journey. So I grew up living in the global south and the global north, and I've spent more than half my life in the global south. I'm a trained engineer. I've studied international development, and I have to say economics was my least favorite subject. And the more I try to run away from it, the more it pulls me back in. But I'm also a trained anthropologist. So one critical question that throughout my entire career has been the critical inquiry, the role, the effects, and the lived experiences of neoliberal and GDP-centric forms of development on local and indigenous communities and their environments in the global south. And I've recently emerged from 11 years of really rare, largely uninterrupted, longitudinal ethnographic fieldwork in Bhutan. I did ethnographies in sub-Saharan Africa and Kenya and Madagascar, and then moved to my ancestral region, which is the Himalayas. And basically, I was searching for the holy grail of development, a living, breathing alternative to development or development alternative. And my path led me to Bhutan, which is really an outlier nation in terms of development because of its development of this idea of gross national happiness, GNH. And that led me then to the degrowth movement. So about a decade ago, Susan Paulson, who was here a couple of weeks ago, organized a panel at the American Anthropological Association with Lisa Gezon on anthropology and degrowth. That was in 2015. That led to the special issue of the journal of Political Ecology on degrowth. But what I want to say is degrowth a decade ago was really at the margins of the margins, right? Fast forward a few years later, and the degrowth movement has ironically grown. The number of books, articles, PhDs, MAs on degrowth have increased significantly. And I think we reached a turning point a few years ago with the EU conference on moving beyond growth. And of course, with the UN Secretary General on appointing a high-level working group on moving beyond growth. So the key question for degrowth is, what does moving beyond GDP and moving beyond growth really mean? It seems to mean different things for different people. And what I've noticed is it's sort of become a catch-all phrase, much like sustainable development and gender mainstreaming. It means sometimes everything and nothing. Like it just seems to be exploding. And I guess what I want to explore is, what does degrowth mean from a global South and a decolonial perspective? Okay, next page. So points of departure. I think we can agree more or less that degrowth is a response and a reaction to GDP and endless economic growth and the exploitation, the destruction, and the extractivism that entails, and the way it externalizes environmental, social, and cultural costs. But I think we need to contextualize degrowth in the wider discussion of development. So development came out at a certain time in the formal decolonization of global South nations. And GDP was instrumentalized to ensure continued colonial relations by the global North. It set up a linear system of like a catching up logic, really measured GDP per capita. And it divided the entire world into HICS, MICS, and LDCs. Where at the time of colonizations, all the countries in the global South were LDCs, and all the countries in the global North were HICS, high-income countries, right? And the LDCs, the low development countries, could graduate eventually up to a MIC, middle-income country, and eventually, to become developed as a HIC, high-income country. These are not just labels. They in turn set up the extent and conditions of financing, loans, debts, interest rates for each country in the global South, where the global South becomes subordinate, dependent, and at the periphery of development. But what GDP also leaves out are historical and colonial forms of debt, which are not captured in that GDP per capita metric. It leaves out historical colonial climate debt owed by the global North to the global South. It excludes other alternatives of development, such as those focused on well-being, that are not focused on production, and that run counter to the single narrow metric measure of GDP. So it also excludes alternatives in the global South that have existed for centuries and millennia, that have preserved to a large extent ecological, social, and cultural landscapes. In 2009, Latouche argued that concepts of degrowth originally emerged from the global South as part of broader critiques of development approaches. And Jason Hickel in 2021 said, he mentions and gives acknowledgement to some of the leaders in the global South who led these critiques against development, including Gandhi and Nyerere. And I want to turn to the question of what can real examples of wellbeing in Ecuador and Bolivia and GNH in Bhutan, for example, tell us about the global North, global South relationship? And what about indigenous cosmologies dating back centuries and millennia that share key conceptual beliefs with degrowth, especially about the relationship between humans, the environment, and more than humans, to name one among many? If degrowth owes its central concepts, tenets, to the global South, why are global South perspectives often omitted, sidelined, excluded, or given second-hand or third-class status? And the question I want to reflect on, and especially towards my conclusion, is the degrowth movement somehow colonial in itself? And I want to use the example of the recent degrowth conference in Oslo. So how many of you here attended that conference? Almost everyone. Okay. All right. I wasn't there in person, but I tuned in to listen to the plenaries. And one thing that jumped off the screen was the tensions around global South perspectives. I don't know if you also noticed that. And so I want you to just reflect for a minute. When you think about the relationship of the global South within discussions of degrowth, if you can think of one word, what would that word be? When you think about the Oslo conference, for instance, can you think? So we're just going to write down some of the words just so we can go back to it. What? What's the word?
No, I think it's conflicted. Okay.
Conflicted? Okay.
No, conflicted for us who were there.
Okay.
The dynamic from those,
Okay. Other words?
Eurocentric.
Eurocentric? That's very good one.
I wasn't there. Yeah. I followed, like you, I followed offline.
Yeah. People that were there?
Internationalist.
Internationalists? Very good. Other words?
I said I would say something about it, so I'm saying I think a lot of the people who were criticizing, because I could see who they were, you could, I think there was a little bit of posture.
Posturing.
Trying to play the more radical than the radical.
Posturing and radical. I think we can put the word radical there too. Any other thoughts? Okay, I'm not sure if people online have thoughts.
I'll write down if they put anything.
Okay, all right. So with those words in mind, if we look at the decolonial degrowth interface, I think we can say that there are some critical gaps within degrowth in terms of decolonial and global South perspectives. At the historic EU conference in 2023 on moving beyond growth, that was a really important moment for degrowth. There was a panel on the global South, one single panel that had Jason Hickel, Raj Patel, and it was quite gender balanced and racially balanced. It was a panel, not a plenary, right? And I understand in the organization of the conference, of course, just getting degrowth on the agenda in EU Parliament is a huge deal. But trying to get the issues around global South perspectives, was also a challenge. So it ended up being a panel and not a plenary. And people came up to me afterwards and they said, why wasn't this a plenary? So I just want you to hold on to that thought, okay? So in terms of global South perspectives, degrowth has not always adequately acknowledged perspectives from the global South. But more particularly, it has not always adequately taken into account real challenges and conundrums born from decolonial and global South approaches that outright challenge growth and GDP. And here, these are just some reflections. It could be because of its academic focus. It emerged and remains global North focused, and movement is perceived as being driven mostly by European male academic scholars. That's the perception. And of course, academics, including myself, sometimes remain highly theoretical, therefore often removed or disconnected from the diverse lived realities of vulnerable people in the global South, especially the negative impacts of degrowing economies in ways that move beyond GDP. But I think that's also changing because just the number of PhDs and MAs working on ethnographically documenting degrowth has also expanded. So I think as I say that, I think that's also shifting, and that's an important shift. But we have to keep in mind that academics in general in the global north have more resources than academics in the global south. So I'm just putting a question out there, not answering it. And then there's the global south lived realities of taking up a degrowth approach. There are a lot of conundrums around this. Dealing with the negative impacts of slowing or negative growth in the global south for people who otherwise depend on growth as a survival strategy against the acute effects of economic poverty, for many of whom economic frugality is an evil necessity rather than a choice. And the knock-on effects of degrowth in the short and medium term, such as loss of jobs, slowing down trade, etc. These are all issues that have to be worked out. And how will degrowth play out in the global south? How do we reconcile different deceleration rates of growth for the global north and the global south towards universally sustainable standards of living in a context where north-south power relations remain imbalanced and to the advantage of the global north, and also to the advantage of powerful corporate transnational actors that defy the nation state. To what extent will the global north degrow in the immediate term with respect to the global south? Additional debates center on what rates of growth should be allowed and for what time period, and what levels of consumption and climate loss and damage is owed from the global north to the global south for consuming far beyond its fair share. Now, these are highly contested and negotiated ideas and issues, as we saw with the recent COP. Okay, these are not easy to resolve. Then there's the global south and the global north, the actual concepts and the ideas of both. There seems to be a homogenizing tendency that gloss over regional and national differences and complexities. For instance, the lived experiences in the global south are different from those living in sub-Saharan Africa than those living in Asia. And within sub-Saharan Africa, there's big differences between North Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa, East, West. There are a lot of regional complexities. And then within countries, there's all kinds of differences. And in a country like Bhutan, for instance, even one village next to the next, there are huge differences. So how do we account for all that kind of complexity that exists? So the prevailing relationship is, of course, a colonial and neocolonial dominance of the global north over the global south, laid upon historical core periphery relations of colonization, exploitation, and extraction of the global south by the global north. The global north and the global south are not just geographical locations, but they're also historical ones. And further complicating the matter, the global north exists within the global south, and the global south exists within the global north. What I'm talking about here is elite capture and privilege that exists in both locales. And in recent years, we've seen the extreme widening of the small group of ultra-rich billionaire class, mostly men, mostly in the global north, although you also have some in the global south. So how does this play out in terms of global south perspectives and decolonial perspectives? So I want to turn to a real existing example of degrowth and lessons from Bhutan. I want to explain how GNH first came into being in 1979. At that time, the fourth king of Bhutan, he was 24 years old, and he was returning home from the non-aligned summit in Havana, Cuba, where other people like Fidel Castro were attending that summit, and he was a good friend of the fourth king of Bhutan. And on his way back, an Indian journalist asked him in Delhi about the status of Bhutan being a poor country. The king replied that instead of focusing on GNP, gross national product, it is more important for Bhutan to measure GNH, gross national happiness. And that's where the term first got coined. Let's put this into global perspective, because this is 1979. 45 years earlier, in 1934, Kuznets himself, the inventor of GDP, issued a stark warning that it should not be used as a measure of progress of nations. And 7 years earlier, in 1972, the same year that the young prince ascended the throne to become Bhutan's fourth king, he was 16 years old when his dad died at the age of 43, and he became the fourth king. The same year, the groundbreaking report, The Limits of Growth, was released. Then we fast forward from 1979 to 2008. 29 years later, the fourth king of Bhutan abdicated the throne, and the fifth king, his son, became the king and also the present king, but under very different circumstances, with shared powers with the parliament, while he kept some key sovereign decision-making powers. Bhutan became an executive monarchical constitutional democracy, much like Liechtenstein, Monaco, Morocco, Jordan, Tonga, Kuwait, and Bahrain. GNH, a lot of work has been done on GNH, mostly carried out by the Center of Bhutan Studies and GNH research based in Bhutan itself. It became a guiding moral concept, a development framework that took the SDGs further because it included a pillar on culture and governance, which there's only three pillars in the SDGs and the MDGs, which is environment, economics, and the social pillar. It became a metric of measurement. It was first tested in 2008, and there was nationwide surveys in 2010, 2015, and 2022. And in some ways, it's more robust and comprehensive than what is being proposed by the UN High-Level Working Group, because it includes domains of culture and time use, which right now are not in the interim report released by the High-Level Working Group. As I argued 5 years ago, it is many things at once. In addition to what I've mentioned, it's a policy screening tool, it's an international concept, and it's a guide for individual practice of happiness. Let's turn to the question of happiness now. GNH is the secularization of Buddhist concepts into the framing of modern development. The concept of happiness, which GNH is founded upon, dates back centuries in Buddhism, back to the Buddha himself. It has been subject to deep philosophical introspection and conceptualization within Buddhism, and it's translated into everyday Buddhist practices and in Bhutan and many other countries. It is estimated that Buddhism spread to Bhutan mostly from Tibet in the 7th century. And right now, approximately 80 to 90% of Bhutanese practice Buddhism. The concept of happiness, now secularized as a development concept and framework and encoded in its constitution, predates GNH, predates degrowth, predates development, predates GDP and economic growth, predates waves of European colonization into South Asia, and predates the notion of the nation state. So what does this mean for a concept that dates back to the Buddha 500 centuries before the Common Era? How do we handle the historical roots of degrowth, GNH, within a degrowth conceptualization? All right, so I wanted to make a few other points to kind of keep track of time. Okay, a few other notes about Bhutan. Bhutan was never colonized. GNH provides an example of a real existing or pre-existing degrowth in the Global South, where Global South perspectives are aligned with degrowth. But Bhutan is one of the few countries in the Global South that escaped formal colonization by European powers. Where does it stand then in decolonial discussions and in terms of decolonial degrowth? In contemporary Bhutan, GNH exists and is counted side by side with GDP. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Bhutan had the fastest GDP growth in the world, with the World Bank praising Bhutan for its fast-paced development trajectory as an example to the world, right? At the same time as it's an example of gross national happiness. The COVID-19 pandemic saw a sharp reversal of this under very strict restrictions that restricted trade, travel, and complete closure of its borders. Let's look at its geopolitical context. Bhutan is sandwiched between two superpowers directly at its borders. China to the north, and which it has no formal diplomatic relations, but who has bitten off small chunks of the country and continues to invade and colonize parts of Bhutan slowly and quietly. And India to the south, with it has formal diplomatic relations. And this tension of being sandwiched geopolitically between these two superpowers has led to tense military standoffs between these two superpowers, China and India, while Bhutan hangs in the balance. Think about it, two powerhouse capitalist nations who pursue GDP growth. And here is Bhutan putting forward the idea of G&H, which challenges GDP. This is a highly contested thing. Of course, it's been subject to pushback. And I should also say that Bhutan is captured by crypto-colonial relations of power. That means effective economic dependence in its relationship to India, not formal, outright formal colonization, but crypto-colonial colonial relations. And also, if we extend that, development itself captures nations in the global south into similar relations of colonial core periphery dependence. So that's another layer of colonialism we need to think about. I'm going to run, there's a lot to say. I was telling Georgia that I had to cut out big chunks of my talk. There's a lot of internal debates within Bhutan about G&H. There's people who believe in it, there's people who don't believe in it. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is that the state is going to make everyone happy. And that actually goes against the central tenets of Buddhism, because in order to be happy, one must generate one's own conditions of positive karma and happiness through the positive actions and good intentions that one takes. The state, though, through its policies around G&H, provides the conditions to enable that kind of happiness. So there's free education, free healthcare, and this is amazing, free veterinary care. So your pets have free healthcare, and I think that's amazing. I had 2 dogs in Bhutan, so I appreciated that. So there is the internal debates about that. And of course, there's also contradictions, especially as G&H is contested and pitted up against GDP. Then you have relations of power within Bhutan that tend to privilege powerful actors, just like any country in the world and any country in the global south and the global north. And externally, how is G&H seen? That also varies dramatically and extremely. Sometimes it's romanticized as a utopia, the happiest country in the world. But if you ask any Tibetologist, they'll tell you that Bhutan is the last culturally intact Himalayan kingdom. And that's important. People in general in my mind, do seem to have a greater handle on happiness, but I think it has to do, and when I say happiness, it's not the kind of happiness that you have when you buy a pair of Nike shoes and you're happy for a second, then it gets old and then people move on to the next pair or whatever, that endless cycle of consumption. It's the deeper sense of happiness, of well-being, actually. So G&H should have not been called G&H. It should be called GNW, Gross National Wellbeing, because really looking at well-being, but at the same time, happiness as it is conceptualized within Buddhism. And I think because of that, it does provide the tools through Buddhist practice, and science only now is catching up to age-old practices around meditation, for instance, that show that meditation leads to greater well-being. But also, sometimes Bhutan and G&H get vilified. Almost automatically, knee-jerk reaction, reverting back to the highly contested expulsion of Nepali-speaking Bhutanese in the 2000s. And its heavy forms of state bureaucracy, which it borrowed from India, and heavy forms of governance. So sometimes G&H gets thrown out with the bathwater. And I wonder, as a concept, if we think about G&H as a concept, much like the concept of democracy, should the concept of democracy be likewise thrown out because of its co-option by fascist actors and billionaire elites? Or do we turn to its checks and balances and pay attention to relations of power? It's a question I'm throwing out there. GNH also has critical gaps around gender equality, its treatment of relations of power. I'm not going to get into that, but I've written extensively on that. So, how are we doing for time? Oh boy, okay. Decolonial degrowth, some reflections. I've raised more questions than I've answered. And I'm going to add a few more. I'm going to try to summarize some of the questions, okay? What does degrowth mean conceptually? Can it mean only one thing, or is it an umbrella movement that brings many concerns together? If so, is there a common theme? And can we agree about, for instance, GDP? Do we get rid of it? Do we complement it? Or is it something else? And this is a tension that I think runs in the high-level working group report that was just released, because they're saying moving GDP means actually keeping GDP. It's an interesting notion. How do we break out of the confusion that generates, through different stances? If, like the high-level working group, the approach is not to get rid of GDP, but to complement it, then what does going beyond GDP actually mean? Is degrowth a panacea for all decolonial struggles, for reparations, restitutions, and colonial movements? And can we converge with those colonial movements? The historical foundations of degrowth matter. Real existing degrowth alternatives in the global south are also rooted in deeper histories and perspectives of well-being. And they are often rooted in longer, deeper spiritual and indigenous cosmological understandings of well-being. And how do we recognize that historically? Because they go farther back. Another point is any nation state or group acting to challenge GDP will hit up against intense resistance, pushback, and backlash, similar to the feminist movement. Global South nations have agency and are fighting back, but it's a messy and complex situation, far from being perfect. The concepts themselves are also being defined and redefined in a fast-moving world. There's a lot we can learn from these struggles and contestations. Can degrowth forge better understandings of the lived realities behind these struggles? Another point, which I didn't have a chance to get into when I explained, when I talked about Bhutan, is that I think there's another form of decolonization within degrowth. And that is, so far, we've talked a lot about human-centric dimensions of well-being. But what about more than humans that we share our planet with, who enable our very survival as a species? How do we recognize their rights, their sentience, and the debt we humans owe to more than humans? Our colonial debt to them for destroying their ecosystems and historical injustices against animal cruelty, a type of human colonization over those who are more than humans. So that's another question. And what do we do in the meantime? While we wait for degrowth alternatives to be born, while we live entrenched in a colonial GDP world. And again, I go back to the fight around gender equality. It's kind of like, how do we enact and embody equality while being faced every day with forms of sexism and patriarchal relations at every corner without burning out? I call this the uneasy bargain. How do we negotiate that space? And can degrowth learn from other social movements, such as the feminist climate justice movements, who have similarly experienced backlash, backsliding, and burnout? Okay, I'm just gonna take a few minutes. I'm almost there. Quick, some convergences. So Jason Hickel, in his article in 2021, has talked about these convergences with degrowth and decolonial perspectives around ecological debt, atmospheric appropriation, human exploitation, environmental destruction and extraction, cheapening of labor and resources in the global south. And he calls out for the need for decommodification, de-enclosure, de-accumulation. I also think we need to take into account historical, colonial, social, gender, and climate justice, and more than humans, the unfair terms of trade, norms of culture of development practice, and contemporary colonial continuities, neoliberal forms of development that privilege the global south at the expense of the global, that privilege the global north at the expense of the global south. But also, we've reached a point of extremes in predatory capitalism, of elite capture by oligarchs, and I mentioned this, the capture of wealth and resources in the hands of a few men in the global north, and there's maybe a few in the global south. So, towards decolonial degrowth, this is the last thing and these are again a series of reflections, right? While austerity measures, development studies have been deadlocked into inaction for a very long time. There were austerity measures such as structural adjustment that in the 80s and the 90s have devastated many countries in the global south. Against that backdrop, Arun Agrawal famously stated in 1990 that critiques of development are empty critiques because one cannot solve the real life problems of economic poverty, lack of services, limited access to resources, and degrading environments with nothing. Nothing being theory and academic critique. Almost 3 decades later, degrowth offers an alternative to a different action-oriented pathway of doing things differently. And I would argue it challenges the root causes of colonial exploitation, extraction, environmental destruction, climate loss and damage, and social injustice. In order for degrowth to be successful, it urgently needs to take on board the concerns and the conundrums of the global south, as I've tried to summarize briefly. It needs to be inclusive of global south actors, perspectives, and lived realities. And I mentioned earlier, I know you mentioned that this is a bit uncomfortable, but the degrowth movements needs to decolonize itself. All degrowth conferences have been held in the global north, but this is not just an issue for degrowth. The International Association of Feminist Economics has had many meetings over many years. Only one has been in the global south, and that's in Ghana. And I'm not talking about mix, according to IMF, it's LDCs, right? There needs to be greater inclusion and ownership by the global south, and academics in the global north, of course, I will mention this, have more resources than those in the global south. And how can we create greater space for genuine conversations about global south perspectives? Lessons from the global south, there exists well-being alternatives in the global south that are closely congruent with degrowth, but they're not always couched under the banner of degrowth. However, they have tended to be excluded and sidelined. This misses valuable lessons as these concepts too have been subject to intense contestation within the nation state and geopolitically, as I explained in the context of Bhutan, as renegade concepts that defy and challenge GDP, hegemonic forms of development, and powerful capitalist forces and actors face pushback, backlash, and silencing. I have also argued about going beyond a human-centric notion of degrowth, beyond human well-being only, and taking into account the agency and the rights of sentient beings, of more than humans. I think that's really critical, and that's another way we can move towards decolonial degrowth. I want to say that when we think about decolonial degrowth, it's not just about North-South relations, it's also about South-South colonial relations, as I explained in the situation of Bhutan and China. But it's also about the broader colonial relations of development in the core periphery kind of relationship. And if degrowth emerged from global South critiques of development, then we need to be much more robust in our acknowledgement of going beyond this kind of coloniality. We need to address those emissions. Degrowth, it's been argued, has been very academic focused. And of course, there's always a focus on publishing. That's just the nature of the beast. There's not always time for activism. And sometimes, when you do your annual review, like it's not even valued, the activist work you do. So I think we need to somehow decolonize academia itself. And I'm just going to wrap up now. We cannot write off real degrowth alternatives just because they're imperfect and they exist in an imperfect world. Because then we would have to write off concepts like democracy too by the same logic. uneasy bargains have to be struck as we live in a GDP world while we try to move towards a degrowth world. There's also lots of hope. There's lots of creative research, ethnographic and qualitative research regarding the real life lived experiences of degrowth that help to illuminate the pushback, the backsliding, the burnout, and the name calling sometimes of degrowth actors. I think there is going to be pushback, and there already is pushback and backsliding and name calling, but I do think that there's a lot of hope and agency in degrowth in strategizing, and I think that's how I want to end, is that we need to strategically think how we're going to handle that pushback and that backsliding and burnout, because if we don't, we're going to end up like the gender equality movement, the feminist movement, where it was moving ahead for many years and now we've seen a backsliding. We need to strategically think about how to deal with that pushback. Thank you. I think I'll end there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ritu. That was great. We've got some time now for questions. So yeah, I will read out anything that comes into the chat, and otherwise, yeah, feel free to ask away. This was a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. But my first reaction is to, of course, to much emphasis on GDP that you have given to the definition of the group. No? For me, for example, the GDP is simply an epitome of what growth is. It's a process of numeration of what the desire of liberalism had rooted in the conceptualization of the human. No? And many times these things are forgotten. No? The external representation of what growth is anthropologically is completely forgotten, while I think the degrowth reflection from the belly of the beast, let's say from Europe, was exactly on that aspect. No? We are keeping writing on the fact that, for example, one of the biggest root of degrowth was the anti-utilitarist movement. So it was the idea that the human, in order to pursue happiness, or was through the process of rationalization, through the process of optimization, through the accounting of what is utility, no, for you as a person, and to pursue this utility until the end. This utility that is the central tenet of the anthropological problem of what growth is, then has the massive representation in the GDP. But it's simply an enumeration of what is the political anthropological subject of the growth is in Europe and in Western culture. If we miss this part, of course, we cannot understand on which base I can connect with other ontologies that are challenging this idea that in order to be happy, you need to be a utilitarian maximizer. And I think in most of the case, unfortunately, in the last decades, people joining the group have completely forgotten this aspect. Sorry, but was my first reaction to your talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're correct. I mean, there's GDP, there's economic growth, there's also capitalism and neoliberalism. The structural adjustment programs are really neoliberal, ideologies, the rolling back of the state, cutting down social services. It had extreme impacts on people. It increased poverty. It increase the workload of women. I mean, and those neoliberal policies have been ongoing, for quite some time. I know I mentioned it like briefly, but that is my concern that degrowth, well, it's a concern, it's a good thing and a bad thing. Degrowth has grown, a lot of people are part of the movement at the EU conference. They thought they were going to have 1,000 people. They had to increase it to 2,000. I don't know, was it 3,000 or 4,000 people that attended? And there's another 2,000 online. So the interest in degrowth is really huge, and it's a really important social movement. But it's people hang all kinds of different things on it. For some people, it's not about GDP. For some people, it is about GDPs. For some, so it just means a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think, the high-level working group, the interim report that just got released, the title is Moving Beyond GDP. It's right there. And the working group is Moving Beyond GDP. It's there in the title, right? But in the EU conference, it was called Moving Beyond Growth. Because I think it was too contentious to say moving beyond GDP, because GDP is so entrenched. So there's a lot of politics on the use of words, GDP or growth, and there's different reasons people use that word. But in the high-level working group, they're saying, well, it's moving beyond GDP, but we're going to keep GDP. And to me, again, I keep making parallels to the gender feminist movement because I've worked in that. To me, it's like saying, okay, we're going to work on gender equality and we're going to move beyond patriarchy, but we're going to keep patriarchy. And it's kind of like, well, how does that work? There's logics of it because we live in a patriarchal world while we want to move to an equal world. And the same thing with GDP. We want to move beyond growth or capitalism or neoliberalism while we live in a world that's entrenched. And how do we negotiate that? But thank you. I agree with you. I think it means so many different things to so many people. But maybe that's a good thing because it's a pluriverse, as people say, of different.
That exactly, because if you miss this aspect of anti-utilitarianism, you won't understand anything about the good.
Absolutely.
But it's my position, and perhaps it's my fault as a person that is writing about degrowth since 20 years now, that the new people enter without understanding this aspect.
Yeah.
So it's I take my responsibility on that.
I think it's a really important point. I agree with you. But for the global south, though, the GDP per capita, but I hope you understand that the whole world is divided by GDP per capita, and it means what loans you get, what interest rates. It's that one number determines so much. And I'm not saying, I'm actually arguing it shouldn't be like that, but it is used in that way. But thank you.
But it's interesting that it's anti-utilitarian thing because I'm teaching a class on it next Wednesday, so I'm reading now again what we were saying about anti-utilitarianism, etc. And if you see the entry in our vocabulary for degrowth in 2014, and it's interesting because it links to Bhutan, because the Mouse School, which is a movement for anti-utilitarianism in the social sciences, out of which Serge Latouche came, they were contraposing to the utilitarian view of the anthropological subject. I think it's a Buddhist conception that has 4 levels: the Dharma, the Karma, and I don't remember what else. So it's where utility, seeking utility at the personal level is one of the 4, and the other 3 are, one of them is also seeking public participation, stipends. So already people were talking about that, and I think what Giacomo was saying that this is perhaps a faster bridge between the growth and the alternative conceptions we want to talk about here in Bhutan. Perhaps GDP and gross national happiness is another bridge, but I think there is this bridge that it's more direct and more fundamental, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that is true. If you enter the growth now, it's completely lost out of parity because it's very quantitative, physical, model policies, everything seems very fixed and perhaps Western.
Hmm. Hmm. No, I think that's a really important point. And I've tried to trace, G&H beyond when it, was 1979, when it was first coined, and trace back, like it goes really far back. And you could keep going, like I said, to the Buddha himself, long time. But then we can do that with a lot of things. I know people here work in all different parts of the world, and if you look at indigenous cosmologies, you can trace that back millennia. And I didn't. There's just one argument that I didn't even bring up here today, but it's about the temporality and the time frames. So if we say degrowth as it was conceptualized in the global north came about at a certain time period, and we can try to fix when that time period is. What does all these things that pre-existed, predated, going back centuries, how do we then handle them? How do we temporarily, in the temporality, like how do we understand and conceptualize that? So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk today and getting us thinking about how do we kind of decenter ideas of thought of degrowth. And Bhutan is such an interesting and unique example. Your work reminds me of how useful it can be to take kind of things that are happening that aren't the norm, right? And help us think through more like majority mainstream trajectories of change from other places. So I really appreciate that. And I'm wondering if you would help this group and myself think through this question that, we're part of this group, many of us in the room, called the Real Project, and it's 30 or 40 different researchers at different stages of our career thinking about degrowth in different ways. And there's been a lot of debate in our group about this idea of, is degrowth something that can be for the world as a whole, or is it an idea that is for, what some people call the global north, and the global south needs something different? And I'm wondering if what you think about, like, for example, right now, Miriam Lang is writing a lot about degrowth from the Andes. And she, I think, builds on Arturo Escobar's work, who I think it was like around 2010 or 12 wrote a really bold statement saying that it's a trap to think of degrowth as only something for the global north, whereas the global south should have development. And here for those virtually, I'm using development like with the parentheticals, like this Western epistemology of development. What do you think about this idea of like can we locate a degrowth, for example, for the Andes, or is doing this move on its own somehow kind of colonizing these indigenous cosmologies that degrowth likes to kind of position itself around?
Okay. It's a really good question. It's an excellent question. Let me come at it from a different perspective. I don't think that the hegemonic, the main actors that have put into place this hegemonic form of development, this core periphery, that help with the continuities, the colonial continuities, like that set into place development in this very skewed relations of power between the global north and the global south. They're not happy with degrowth. They don't like degrowth, and that says something to me, because I think degrowth challenges those sets of colonial relationships, and there are examples where I was at a conference. I'll go into details. I won't say names, which conference and which actor, but the most powerful actor in development had people there, and myself and others had put together a panel on degrowth, and they went on the sides of the meeting, they went up to them and told them not to do that. So that's something. And I think so that tells me that we are pushing at these colonial relations of power, and I think that's good. So I would say yes. I think degrowth, it's a movement that I personally think should include the global south. And I think it's a way of countering these deeply colonial development relations and discourses and practices that affect the global south in real ways that disadvantage them. I think it's a way of addressing them. But I can't, like, I keep going back to these other movements, you know, the climate loss and damage movement, the feminist movement. And I think if degrowth doesn't talk to these other movements and doesn't listen and hear about the struggles they faced, then I think degrowth might be setting itself to repeat some of the mistakes of not strategizing, because the forces are incredibly powerful that we're taking on. And there's going to be there already is pushback, there already is going to be that. So, but I think we have to be careful, because a long time ago, like in the 1990s, there was, you know, I was at the Beijing conference in '95, the UN conference on women, and a lot of the women in the global south said, hey, we're being excluded. The kind of development, gender and development you're talking about is for the global north. You're not taking into our concerns that are very different from the concerns. And there was these articles, you know, Under Western Eyes, a very famous article, you know, and I think so I think if we look at those parallels, I think it's like, I feel like it's the same. I think degrowth has to think about how it can be more inclusive, you know, and not be under Western eyes, and realize that it means different things to different places in the global north. You know, I'm just coming back to Canada after more than 2 decades of living in the global south. I'm struck at how individualistic everything is. And I think individualism, that's something that's very different from a lot of places in the global south, although development is breaking those things down as we speak as well. So that's why I was arguing against the homogenization.
We're just at 5, oh sorry. No, we're just at 5 o'clock now, but we have one question on the chat, so if it's okay, committee will take that as well. And then we can close up. So this is from Armando, and he says, the case was made to include a more accurate story of degrowth and wellbeing proposals that include a global history. What other strategic benefits would deeper South-North integrations provide?
Can you say that one more time?
Yes. The case was made to include a more accurate story of degrowth and wellbeing proposals that include a global history. What other strategic benefits would deeper South-North integrations provide?
Well, I think the first thing is just sharing of resources, redistribution of resources. I think that has been like one of the biggest calls from a degrowth perspective, but also the decolonial movement also has been requesting that. The world is pretty integrated already. One of my field sites in Bhutan was the extreme north corner, where there's not even a road. So when I first went there, it took 2 days to get up there. About 3,800 meters above sea level. It's really high up in the mountains, just below Tibet. But you know, in the time that I've been working there, I've seen development inroads, and we can argue, you know, whether those are neoliberal, utilitarian, you know, all these different inroads, and they're impacting people on the ground in different ways. And so I think whether even in the furthest corners of the world, whether people like it or not, they are being integrated. But the problem is that integration is coming in a very colonial, global north determined way. And if you look at you know, the arguments for decolonizing development, who gets to vote within multilateral organizations? The voting rights are not equal between the global north and the global south. Who gets to formulate the policies? Who gets to formulate the interest rates, the terms of trades? They're not very equal. And so I think integration for me means it has to be from a place of equality, and it also has to be from a place of restorative justice. for the colonialism, climate loss and damage. So integration is happening, but it's not happening on equal terms. So I think that's what we have to think about going forward. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much, Ritu. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, if for